Good. So, in this session, we were going to take the theme of discipleship. The Buddhist expression for this is to take refuge in the teacher, the guru, the master. Christians speak perhaps more often about following Jesus. And in the early part of the Gospels, we see Jesus gathering his disciples. And he gathers them by calling them. He says, "Come, follow me." And they respond in the stories by dropping their fishing nets or leaving their desks and immediately leave everything and follow him. And this ideal or image of discipleship is, I think, central to the Christian identity in some way, or Christian meaning. But it is, of course, also universal, particularly in the monastic tradition. The Desert Fathers, the early Christian monks, were hermits at first, living in the desert. And they...
Sorry.
And
the Sunny and the 14th, okay, Crown Sunday, you had to do it. So, number two is Sunny, Jogi Namana. No, Krishna, Crown means. Yes.
Okay. So, in the desert, the monks would be in solitary practice, but disciples would come to them to learn from them, most of all by example, and it was about living with your teacher. That was the most important way in which you learnt. It wasn't so much about intellectual study or information, but seeing how your teacher responded to the situations of daily life or to moods and emotions and conflicts. Excuse me. So it was by example, sharing in the life of the teacher in a very simple, basic, domestic way. And then there was a kind of a contract between the disciple and the teacher. On the disciple's side, the disciple had to be completely open, completely trusting, and tell the truth, and say everything that he was going through. And on the master's, the teacher's, guru's side, he was faithful to the disciple. He would never abandon the disciple. So there's this contract of fidelity and truthfulness that made the teacher-disciple relationship. And this was seen as an expression of the relationship of the disciple to Jesus. The ultimate guru in the Christian vision is Jesus. Although, of course, we have human gurus and visible gurus as well who can guide us in particular ways, but it is always the Spirit of Christ who is seen to be active in that person. And it was my own experience with John Main, for example. So in our human experience of discipleship, we discover why Jesus tells us, if you are to follow me, you must leave self behind. We were speaking about leaving our self-centeredness. And that was the call of Jesus. If you wish to follow me, leave self behind. And then he says in another passage, leave all your possessions behind. And Now that sounds very extreme and very dramatic, but that is the essence of discipleship. How we do that, of course, depends upon our calling in life, our vocation, our destiny, how we are meant to live. But it is a form of monastic renunciation, to leave everything. And I think this is what we do in meditation. At the time of meditation, we renounce everything. We were talking about emptiness at lunch. And although emptiness is a Buddhist term, sunyata, it is also a Christian concept in the idea of poverty of spirit. In meditation, by letting go of all the riches of our mind, imagination and thought and so on, we come to this experience where we are impermanent and where we are interdependent. And I think that is the essence of emptiness as well. So discipleship demands a radical renunciation. We may make that renunciation in different forms of life, but meditation is common to all those forms of life. And I think it takes us to the essence of discipleship. What is the bond that unites us to teachers in our lives? Do we need teachers? Do we need them throughout our life? Sometimes the guru appears in your life for a period and then is no longer there physically. But nevertheless, you would say they remain your teacher throughout your life. Then there are different kinds of teachers we have. There may be one fundamental teacher. I think for the Christian that would be Jesus, for the Buddhist that would be the Buddha. And then there are other teachers who have a formative influence, help to make us, form us, shape us, and those who make other, maybe less important contributions to our journey. It's a very unique and personal relationship, and it carries with it a grace, an energy, a way of expanding our consciousness, which is deeply personal, but also transforms us and changes us. But it's a very sensitive relationship, and it has a great potential. If you think of the teachers that you had at school or in your profession or professional life, the relationship with a teacher can be a negative one also. The teacher has power over the student. And so, therefore, if the teacher cannot handle the intensity of the relationship can become non-productive, even corrupting, because of the ego. The ego can spoil or corrupt the relationship in two ways. It could be on the disciple side. The disciple becomes possessive of his teacher, doesn't want to share his teacher with others, or becomes psychologically over-dependent on his or her teacher, so that they don't grow into full maturity. So that would be on the disciple side. On the teacher's side, the danger is that they are not able to use the power or the authority that they have, and the projection that is an inevitable part of the teaching process, projection from the student to the teacher. They put them on a pedestal and too high up and worship the teacher and so on. And the teacher can take this too literally and abuse the relationship or the power. So I think if we speak about this relationship, we have to be very honest that it can be very powerful and liberating and empowering. It can bring the disciple into maturity, but it can also go wrong if there isn't a sufficient maturity in the teacher. So discipleship is a liberating and a fulfilling human relationship that brings the disciple into the fullness of their potential. Jesus says it is enough for a disciple to be like his teacher. And yet he also says to his disciples before he leaves them, he says, "You will do greater things than me." And that seems to me to be why we can trust Jesus as a teacher, because he doesn't try to possess the power that he has or possess his disciples. You know, a good teacher is happy if the student fulfills his potential and may do greater things than the teacher. A good teacher is happy about that. And I think Jesus is a good teacher for that very reason. He sees that the accumulation of experience and energy within the Christian community of disciples produces greater things than he was able to do in his own lifetime. Now, the question is about discipleship in the modern world. In the ancient world and in the traditional religions, this relationship was seen as a special grace, perhaps, but also something central to the idea of spiritual growth and formation. It was a fast track to maturity and to individuation, provided that the connection between the disciple and the teacher it was in a healthy place in the disciple and in the teacher. So I think we're very conscious today of the psychological dimension of this relationship and of the danger of unhealthy connections. But the other question is, does modern culture and modern sense of individual worth and individual dignity and so on, how does that relate to the traditional idea of following a teacher? I think it's much more challenging for modern people, certainly modern secular people, to understand the nature of this relationship. So I think perhaps there is a greater awareness today of the need for the disciple to be committed to personal maturity, personal responsibility, and personal practice, and not to be dependent psychologically on the teacher. And also the social structures are very different. But I still think that this is still a relationship of grace that is universal and always present. And we have to be able to recognize in the circumstances of our own lives where these relationships exist. And then we are then responsible for how we take that opportunity, because no good teacher is going to force himself or herself onto the disciple. They may give the invitation, come, follow me, or open the opportunity, but then today especially, where we are aware of the power of choice in coming to maturity, it's up to us to respond. Discipleship means a deep listening. And listening is the basis of obedience. The word obedience in English comes from the Latin word ob audire, which means to listen. So to be obedient is to listen. Disciple, the word disciple comes from the Latin discere, which means to learn. So we're learning by a deep listening. And the essence of discipleship is, I think, a certain kind of spiritual friendship, not the domination of one person over another, but in friendship there has to be a fundamental equality, that relationship that His Holiness was talking about at the beginning of the session this morning, of just one human being to another. Although the differences between those two human beings may be very great, they are fundamentally equal in their humanity. And that's what, there's no friendship without equality. It has to be this acceptance of equality for there to be for there to be friendship. This relationship, as it develops in its own unique way over time, maybe a short time or maybe many years, this relationship, I think, has an effect both upon the disciple and upon the teacher. The disciple experiences it as a healing and an empowerment and a liberation from fear, because in the relationship, the disciple is turned towards the teacher to listen in a deep and obedient way and to serve. Again, this question of service has to be understood in a modern psychological sense, but that is the role of the disciple, is to find their own empowerment and maturity in a spirit of service. And the relationship provides the opportunity for that. We see it in other forms of education, sitting at the feet of a good professor, going to their classes, and the students of that professor will be very happy to be of service in the class or in preparatory work or in research. But at the spiritual level, the service goes deeper and may take other forms. Discipleship is not about belonging to a sect. The corrupt form or false form of discipleship is one that gathers around a teacher but becomes a kind of a closed circle that is inward looking. But what we see in both in the Buddha and in Jesus, calling their disciples to them and training them and giving them the example of how to live, we see a community forming that is turned outwards to the benefit of the world, not just to the benefit of the Sangha or the community of disciples. And that's, I think, one of the real tests of true discipleship, that it produces through the love and fidelity and obedience to the teacher, it produces people who are turned outwards in the spirit of service to the world at large. Community is essential to discipleship. Although the relationship between the teacher and the disciple is a deeply intimate and personal one, it happens within community, strangely enough. And this, I think, also helps to ensure the health of the relationship. And it keeps the center of the relationship away from the ego, the possessiveness or the tendency of the ego to try to control. I can only say, in my own experience with Father John, he was a strong teacher with a very clear vision and strong personality, but I don't think he ever told me what to do. And there were many times when I was in doubt or confused about various questions or things I should do or not do. I could discuss them with him, but he would never say, well, this is what you've got to do. But after the conversation, it would be very clear to me what I should do. And then I would hopefully do it. But that's a certain quality of a true teacher, I think, to help to bring the disciple to their own clarity and then empower them to make their own choice. And that takes place both within the intimacy of the friendship, but also within the community. So I think those are some of the elements of discipleship as I see them from my own experience and in the Christian tradition. I think that it's the modern culture is challenging to this, largely because excuse me, our idea of our self, of our personality, of what the self is, has changed, but also because in the modern world we have become much more atomized, much more individualistic. And as a result of that, the ego structure in modern culture is very strong in one sense, but very weak in another sense. It's very strong in the sense that our ego is developed through materialism and consumerism to be very self-centered, and but very weak in that it makes it difficult for us to transcend. It takes a certain strength in the ego, a certain kind of strength in the ego to transcend itself. And that's what the relationship of the disciple to the teacher allows this transcendence to take place, as it does in meditation. This is why we need teachers of meditation. Why nobody would begin to meditate, I think, without the example of others. So that's a question I think we could maybe discuss a little later. The teacher, it seems to me, is an integral part of the spiritual journey and a wonderful grace and gift in our lives, an opportunity that comes, and when it comes, we should be able to recognize it and embrace it. And it's something, I think, that meditation prepares us for. People begin to meditate today for many different reasons. To restore their hair, to improve their cholesterol, to cope with stress and so on. And that's a perfectly valid way to begin, or motivation to begin. But I think once you've begun to feel the physical or psychological benefits of meditation, you also begin to discover there is a spiritual dimension to your being. And at this point in your development, and this point in your journey of meditation, a teacher becomes very valuable and will appear in some form at the right time in the right way. And apart from the individual teacher, which is, I've been concentrating upon that, but apart from the individual teacher, which is a special grace, I think there are other ways in which we can experience discipleship through community, through the weekly meditation group. As you know, Your Holiness, we have weekly meditation groups that meet in churches, in schools, in universities, in parishes, in all sorts of places of work. And I think the group develops a friendship through the practice of meditation together. Many of you are parts of meditation groups. I think that becomes a teacher. Or let's say we experience the Spirit, who is the teacher. Jesus tells us that he will continue to teach us through the Spirit. The Spirit will be your teacher, he says, after I have gone. So we can experience the teacher, the Spirit, through the meditation group, and of course, through the scriptures, and through any form of human activity, of art or music or science, which manifests the truth. So, but I think the relationship, the central relationship with one's teacher is the guiding light through the different phases of one's life.